Okay, everyone. Very good morning to you all. I'm Alastair Donald. I'm Associate Director of the Future Cities Project. We're very proud to be partners with the Institute of Ideas today for this series of debates throughout the day on urban living. This was apparent, I think, from earlier this year, with the release of the National Archives of Cabinet papers from 30 years ago. It's not really so long ago that we were thinking of cities purely in terms of the decline. What we saw in the Cabinet papers from 1981 was Geoffrey Howe's idea that cities, that Liverpool in particular actually, in response to the talks to Thrives, its future would be one of managed decline. You know, that after a century of suburbanisation and decentralisation, the question wasn't so much of a vibrant future for cities as perhaps, was there a future for cities at all? So, in 1981, as it happened, it was Heseltine that won out the battle in the Cabinet with Howe. And from there on, we had the urban regeneration game started, and ever since then, cities and urban living has been viewed in much more positive terms, I think. But nevertheless, it's not difficult to detect a sense of anxiety about the future of cities. And I think it's that combination of celebration of urban living along with the kind of anxieties of the urban future that we want to examine in the series of debates across today. So we'll be looking at have sessions on issues ranging from how we view crowds and people within cities to the role of preservation to examining how we build the housing and the infrastructure that we need in the next period ahead. This session is one that is called Urban Hubris and the Great Inequality Debate. And I think the idea to do this discussion emerged from a series of articles in the papers over the past year, many of which homed in on the London Shard, the new tower and London Bridge that you can see from out on the terrace there, and discussed it in terms of being a real problem. So a typical article from Jonathan Jones in The Guardian is kind of worth quoting at length. He says, "The meaning of this building's monstrous size is blatant. The Shard is self-evidently a monument to wealth and power run way out of control. It screams with dazzling arrogance that money rules this city and sees money inhabits a realm way above our heads. It's a vision of the financial sector floating above the proletarian streets, living by different rules and shaping events below with icy ease." Jones went on to argue, if you were really looking for clues as to how Britain got broken, then this is a manifest symptom of a society gone wrong. It's kind of quite an interesting idea in that it seems to suggest that whereas in the past problems of social cohesion were a product of poverty, or at least the reactions of the kind of less well-off areas of society, these days we see problems in terms of wealth and its cultural manifestations. So in this section, we want to kind of look at that, examine some of those arguments, ask whether it matters if tall buildings symbolize disparities in wealth, and even if London is seen to be slightly apart from cities in the rest of Britain, does development, no matter how uneven, benefit us all, or is it actually a problem? Are we really just kind of engaging in populist banker bashing? Or is the life really being driven out of cities by a kind of commercialisation and corporatisation of the urban realm? So to help me, I've got four excellent speakers. I'm going to introduce them in the order that they speak. First of all, on my immediate left is Martin Earnshaw, who's a member of the Battle of Ideas Organising Committee. He chairs the Institute of Ideas Social Policy Forum and also the Future Cities Project monthly readers group, which you can find out more about from some of the flyers in this room. And he's the co-editor of a 2008 book called Future of Community, Reports of a Death Greatly Exaggerated. Next up, on my far left, is Anna Minton, who's an award-winning journalist and media broadcaster, written a number of important reports over the years on issues such as fear, trust and privatisation of public space. And she's written them for think tanks that range from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation through to Demos. In 2009, she published what I think is a quite important book, Ground Control: Fear and Happiness in the 21st Century City, which was recently actually updated to include a chapter on the Olympics. And if you want to buy that book, and I'd recommend you do, then it's available in the bookshop along the corridor, and Anna will actually be signing copies of the book afterwards. So again, good reason to go and buy it. Next, after that, on my immediate right is Sunder Katwala. He's the director of the independent think tank British Future, which aims to inform and deepen the public conversation on issues of identity, immigration, integration and opportunity. Sunder was previously General Secretary of the Fabian Society. He's been a leader, writer and internet editor of The Observer and a research director of the Foreign Policy Centre. He's a regular appearer in all sorts of media as well. And last but not least, on the far right is Rob Killick. He's co-founder and chief executive of cScape, a digital agency which has been surfing the waves of the digital revolution for 20 years now. Rob's a frequent speaker at conferences and debates, and he's written about a wide range of issues on digital issues and economic growth for a wide range of publications. So, the debate is, as you've probably grown used to over the past day or so, will be 4 speakers will give short introductions. I'll be keeping them to time. They've got about 5 to 7 minutes. I'll be stopping them after 7, so if you can keep to time, that'd be great. Then we'll have a little chat amongst ourselves in the panel, and then it'll be out to you for questions and contributions. So, without further ado, Martin.
Okay, thank you very much. Part of the genesis of this session is an article earlier this year by Neil O'Brien of Policy Exchange, who wrote an article arguing every measure of income, qualification, political outlook, London differs so radically from the Western UK as to constitute another country. Economically, Londoners earn a good 10k more than people in the west of the country, especially in the north. London has twice as many people with degrees per head of population in the west of the country, and politically and culturally too. London is often accused of being, well, London is the political capital and also the media place, and it's an argument that London-centric perspectives dominate national life. When we saw the Olympics before it started, we were saying it was going to be the London Games. It is true London didn't have issues, so say green issues or immigration issues in the west of the country. To argue that London is pulling away from the west of the country in terms of wealth, or is not necessarily argue the west of the country is getting poorer, notwithstanding the recession, which obviously has the outside London's been harder hit. The South East has generally benefited from London's growth, and after decades of decline, cities such as Manchester and Bristol, Leeds have grown in the past decade and still show promise even after the downturn. In some areas, cities such as Sheffield and Leeds and areas such as Rochdale are still in deep decline. When people say it's a profound pessimism about the efficacy of previous regeneration efforts, or even the possibility of regenerating declining areas, it's these kind of stubborn areas they tend to talk about. But the broader question is, if London is much richer than the rest of the country, is this intrinsically a bad thing? It may be desirable in theory for development to be equal, but one has to ask equality for what? Historically, some areas have developed faster than others for reasons of geography or resources in part of the Industrial Revolution, and certain cities growing there, China's coastal cities, the coast growing faster than the rest of the country. And there are some good arguments we make for equality between regions. You can argue that growth should mutually benefit all regions, or at the worst off should demand more as general prosperity increases. Indeed, in the post-war period, there was attempts to flatten economic differences throughout the country by ensuring industries spread equally around. However, Lincoln's had pros and cons of that strategy. The idea of spreading wealth in these ways was assumed that belief in growth and increasing growth. And today, when people argue against inequality, they don't mean this at all generally. I think in terms of the way the argument for equality is now framed, it's out of the prism of sullen resentment, resentment against the 1% in particular. I think the idea of London being a country does fit into this feeling that only richer people live there, or in London itself, that people, or some people are rich than others. Or the other side is outright condescension. Far from any vision of good society sharing increasing wealth, the growth of London, or any disparity of wealth, is likely assumed to be a threat to those left behind, and populist attaching to more systematic arguments like the spirit level. The assumption is that unequal growth in itself, even if all levels of society were getting richer, is likely to generate resentment, riots, poor mental health, and early death. I think in this perspective was very much the heart of New Labour's approach to social exclusion, which very easily shades into more authoritarian agendas with respect to, for example, with its obsessive focus on social behaviour. Broken Britain had a very similar discourse. And while these perspectives had a language of blame, they also had a language of infantilisation. The assumption that people can fend for themselves. A recent example of this was Alan Milburn's Social Mobility Report this week, which suggested lowering entry requirements for universities. So rather than people working harder to get on top, it's more about lowering the actual bar so that people can get a leg up for artificially rigging the system. This, however, clashes with another discourse I think is also important that when we talk about London versus regions, which is essentially that centrally-led development has fallen out of favour and is now viewed as cities should be free to choose policies themselves. So regional development agencies have gone by the wayside and local enterprise partnerships are in vogue. And the justification for that is essentially that cities should be able to choose what works and what doesn't. That's part of the discourse about the big society or locals, where we exhorted to volunteer and take responsibility for services in mobile and with strivers. This forms a paradox of hard policy. On the one hand, we're told that skilled workforce is the way to get ahead, and on the other hand, we're told that we can't fend for ourselves. People who are socially responsible should be socially mobile and move where the jobs are, but at the same time, there's a feeling that people just can't cope with it. Final point, I'm running out of time. A few years ago, Policy Exchange wrote this infamous report arguing for at least as well as interpret media, which should white off the north and encourage people to move to the south. Yesterday, we had this slight discussion about the riot session about the pros and cons of this. But it's worth noting that recent Work Foundation reports argues that the same thing. But at the time, they were castigated for it. I would sort of argue it might not be a bad thing for young people in areas of high unemployment to move more than they do. And this might actually help resolve the problems of unemployment more than our use of funds and work programme.
Perfect, Simon. Thank you very much, Martin. Okay, Anna, over to you.
Okay, well, I was only asked to talk for 5 minutes, so I'm just going to respond to the questions put by the title of this debate and some of the points that Martin's raised. I think there's a little bit of a muddle in some of the framing of this debate, so I'm just going to deal with one of the statements here. Does it matter if tall buildings symbolise disparities of wealth, or does the development of cities benefit all of us? Or what's that actually asking us? That question is basically saying, does trickle-down work? So let's look at that question head-on, because I think that's obscured, actually. So trickle-down, which I presume quite a lot of you in the audience are familiar with, is the idea that the wealth created in areas, in very wealthy areas, let's take Docklands as a sort of ultimate model, will trickle down to the poorest parts which need it the most. And I mean, I think it's abundantly clear and has become clearer than ever over the last generation that this, simply fails to happen. And it was clear from the word go. I mean, if you look at Canary Wharf and you look at surrounding Isle of Dogs, trickle down just doesn't happen. And actually what you get instead is totally divided communities living side by side with each other, but a world away from each other. And actually what you saw in Docklands wasn't trickle down, but a sort of a displacement and spreading effect. So the areas of wealth have grown larger, and the areas of poverty have grown smaller, but not because the poor people have risen up to sort of join in this prosperity, but because they've been displaced further out into Essex, into Barking and Dagenham. And actually this flight of the white working class community from this part of London was a very big factor in the rise of Nick Griffin and BNP, which fortunately has now fallen apart owing to a very good fight back in that area. But really, Docklands is a sort of the clearest example, and even back then when Canary Wharf was being first envisaged, there was a lot of opposition to it, and people said, this is what's going to happen, and indeed it did, and this is what we've seen in all our towns and cities around the country, that these engines of economic growth, these very large centres in the centres of cities, I've written a lot about how these places are entirely privately owned, privately controlled. These do not spread wealth to the rest of the city. They create these segregated enclaves, and that's what I've spent a lot of my time writing about. There's another phrase I just wanted to pick up on, which Alastair raised, and he said that today, in the past, the problems of social cohesion were seen as problems of poverty, and these days the problems of social cohesion are seen as problems of wealth. And again, I think that's sorry, Alastair, I don't mean to, with respect, but I think that's a bit muddled again.
Question.
Yeah, I mean, it's more of a question of the way we are organising ourselves. It's not whether or not the problems of cohesion are those of poverty or of wealth, but of the whole context in which we are organising ourselves. And actually, we have been organising ourselves on this trickle-down economics model for the last generation. And the financial crisis notwithstanding, which has shown how empty and moribund that model is, we are continuing to just hope for a return to business as usual. Martin raised the question of equality for what? Well, I've written an awful lot about the landscape which results as a result of these growing disparities in equality, the segregation, the gated communities, the increasing high security, when we have areas of great wealth side by side with areas of poverty, and the fact that actually this creates a climate of far greater fear and distrust between people, which I think is something that's incredibly concerning. And Martin also raised New Labour's approach to social exclusion. Well, what was the context for that? The context for that was that New Labour actually presided over the sharpest growth in inequality that we had yet seen, which is continuing today. And then, they came out with this package of programmes to deal with the social exclusion that they were helping to foment. And indeed, a lot of those programmes, I agree, were incredibly authoritarian. But let's look at the economic context first and foremost. So I think we just need a little bit of clarity in the debate, and we need to be really clear about what we're talking about. So thank you.
Great. Raises a number of very important issues, I think, and I think we should come back to a number of those points and see if we can just unpick them a little bit. So, there are Sunder.
Thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me. I mean, part of the way this discussion was kind of set up around the Shard and so on was also about, London's relationship with the rest of the country. One of the things I was thinking about at the end of the summer was why so many people had been somewhat taken by surprise and said they'd been taken by surprise by the sort of the Olympics. It seemed there was an element of surprise that the country was capable of holding the Games, and also that it was capable of, in a sense, rallying to it and feeling connection to it. And I certainly know that in the sort of fortnight beforehand, certainly, media and commentators and so on, everyone was saying something about it. So I was getting a lot of people saying, well, this is a very London thing, it's just going to be very London. I think one of the big reasons that people slightly misread the type of response there'd be was this idea of this, and so something that happened in London was not relevant to other people. And there was evidence against this at the time. For example, the fact that the sort of suspension of disbelief of the torch as it wended its way all the way through the United Kingdom was obviously working to sort of people coming out for it and therefore feeling a connection. They weren't saying this would belong to London. But that was at odds with a sort of quite growing, I think, narrative of the separateness of London, planet London, London's another country. Of course, London is a different place. It's different from any other city in Europe, just in terms of its scale, the scale of its economy. It's obviously more affluent, more diverse, and more liberal than the rest of the United Kingdom, although it's actually Scotland is also distinctively liberal, and not because it's more diverse, but for other reasons. But we overstate this and we exaggerate this, and then we sort of set up problems that don't exist and perhaps ignore problems that do. Because if London was on a different planet, two things would be true. Londoners would think differently about their country and the world from everybody else, and everybody else would notice that and resent it and resent London. And this is much less true than is often claimed, including in a funny way in the very London-dominated media, which partly wants to say London is very different as a sort of endorsement of London values over the sort of their bedraggled view of everywhere else. But it isn't actually true if you look at how people think about the world. People in London have very similar views about the economy, about public services, about national identity. They still have sort of national identity in quite a strong way. And it's not true as well that other people outside London resent London. A bit of polling that British Future did, which on attitudes to things that people feel about England and Britain. One thing we asked was the perceptions of London. And we found that 90% of Londoners are proud of London and are proud of it as a symbol of national identity. You might expect that. But so are 3/4 of people across England, including 70% of people in the Midlands and 2/3 of people in the North, saying they're proud of London. And so levels of resentment of London are actually quite low. So it made me ask, what is the purpose of this kind of separating off of London and treating it as a planet Mars? It's part, I think, of an argument that it's become a sort of monstrous Tower of Babel. It's a foreign cosmopolitan place. It's too diverse. It is a foreign country. It's been turned into a foreign country. And that serves the argument that you can't do solidarity in places that have diversity. You can't maintain identities with diversity. None of this is true, actually, about modern civic identities. Actually, London has quite a powerful sense of its own identity, but it's also an English and a British identity. Now, I don't think very much about the Shard, because I don't think many people in London do. And in a way, the reason the Shard isn't a problem in the way that it's being expressed there is just because it isn't that important in terms of London's sort of identity. So London doesn't seem like the sort of city. It seems like something you do in sort of a Dubai or Qatar or something. Build the highest building in the world to do it. I mean, if you build the highest building in the world in London, I think a lot of people, don't particularly notice you've done it. It doesn't seem to me to massively sort of reflect it. So I'm slightly sympathetic to the sort of Shard skeptics who think it's a bit sort of hubristic and a bit arrogant, but I don't notice it very often, and I don't think many people do. Does this mean there's nothing to worry about? I don't think it's true. I think I'd like to reject the sort of miserabilism that suggests that this is all sort of absolutely difficult and the sort of grievances that will necessarily set city against the rest of the country and all the rest of it. But look for where the reasonable anxieties are. I think London does have a legitimacy challenge, and certainly the City of London, and in a sense the liberalism of London, they also have legitimacy challenges because they've got to show people who want to maintain a sort of liberal open society have to show that it will work broadly for the country and not only work for London, and that requires, I think, there's something in the sort of tone of voice about the way you make the case for either the social liberalism or a certain degree of economic openness, which I think is reasonably, but how far it goes is a good question. I think there's a necessity for more balanced growth. Because if trickle-down doesn't work, that leaves the question of what does work. And there's also a need for more balanced growth, and it's not obvious what the levers and the tools are. You could do things to not have the sort of finance-led, London-led southeast growth, but it's not obvious that giving it up gets you something better instead, unless you've got a plan to get something better. So saying we'd like to live in a sort of more German economy sort of sounds lovely, but you've got to have a route map from the economy you have to one that's got different features, and that's very difficult. But the reason it's necessary now to do it is that actually there's a sort of legitimacy challenge within the area of high growth, actually, because there's quite a powerful sense that if you go out and talk to normal people around the place, including the southeast, that the country is overcrowded. And the country isn't overcrowded, but there's a sense, there's quite a powerful subjective sense that the southeast is. And actually there are, I think, pressures on population, services, etc. in the southeast. So there's actually a barrier. If you think about The Economist cover this week, is about attacking the government's immigration policy as daft and anti-growth. And of course, it might well be daft, it might well be anti-growth, but it's also quite popular because of this perception of pressure of population, space and people. So the problem of the distribution of growth is also the problem of the distribution of population. If you don't spread the growth, you then get to have policies that will put quite a strong brake, potentially, on the growth. So it's now in the interest of the areas of high growth to also spread it, but it's not obvious how we do it. I think the other thing to worry about, to end on this, is that I think there is now a bigger psychological polarisation emerging because you're in an era of very low growth, and so competition for resources becomes stronger. I think there is a sort of territorial, spatial polarisation in an age of austerity. I think what the government is doing is probably quite popular still with people who voted for it, or it's only unpopular because they're not kind of right-wing enough or doing enough for the sort of UKIP wing. And I think it's quite frightening to a lot of people if they work in the public services, if they work in the north. So I think you see a geographical stratification. I think in some ways it's easier to deal with the mobility challenges, the inequality challenges of London, because town hamlets and East End are kind of close at hand in a way that Middlesbrough and Hartlepool kind of aren't. But I think if you can't deal with this polarisation, then I think we will get the types of problems that I don't think we yet have. So we don't live on a different planet, and we should make sure it doesn't happen.
Okay. And Rob, your thoughts?
I don't know how many of you read Hilary Mantel's book, Bring Up Embodies. Has anyone read it? It's a fantastic book. And I was reading it. It's about Thomas Cromwell, who rose from nothing in London. He was the son of the son of a guy who ran an inn, to become the most powerful man in the world, basically. Certainly in the known world at that time, as the advisor to Henry VIII. And it's all set in London in the 16th century. And when I was reading it, most of the action is centred around his house in Austin Friars, which is just down the road, and it's still there. And one dark night, I set off to go to the Gherkin to meet some friends at the bar at the top of the Gherkin. And the city at night it's quite confusing. You can get lost very easily if you're walking. And it was raining and it was dark, and I kind of wasn't really concentrating. And I suddenly found myself in this narrow alleyway, basically, and not knowing where I was. I looked up and it was Austin Friars. And I felt the whole history of London come down on me just in that kind of one moment. And then a few minutes later, I was in the bar at the top of the Gherkin, the Gherkin building just over there, which is the very tip. And the bar is in a circular tip of the building. And when you're in it, you feel as if you're in a spaceship hovering over London. You can't see the building. All you can see is everything else. And you look down on the old city, the new city. So from, within the space of a few minutes, I went from the 16th century to the future. And that, I think, the magic of London is something we have to remember. And in a way, the discussion about London is very polarised. It feels as if you're either identify with the aspirational part of London, or you worry about the poverty and the kind of downsides of London. You either appreciate the magic of it, or you're overwhelmed by the miserable kind of sides of it. And getting about actually, I think all of us feel both of those things. I've lived in London my whole life, and sometimes I wake up and I look at the city and I think it's amazing. And then you can have a bad day, transport doesn't work, it's raining, everyone looks miserable, people are snapping at each other on the underground, and you think, oh my God, I wish I was somewhere else entirely. So I think, you know, we all, as Londoners, embody both sides of this. But I think it's very important that we look at the positive aspirational side of it rather than the miserable side of it. But then, two or three general observations. The history of humanity is one of movement from the countryside to the city. That's basically what happens and what has happened to us over the sort of progress that we've made. And you know, the word civilization itself comes from the Latin word for city. You know, that is the thing that it was cities that enabled us to stop living in rural idiocy. You know, otherwise we would all be peasants trying to scratch a living off the land. Young people in particular, you know, I don't know, you know, where you guys came from or anything, but most young people, if they're not born in London or not born in a big city, want to get there as fast as possible. They want to get away from the limitations of the small town life or the countryside or anything else. I mean, they might not want to stay there forever, but that's the instinct which drives people. And I think even the sort of criticism of the Shard and everything else, I mean, it's always been part of human aspiration to build up. You know, if you look at the cathedrals and the churches of the Middle Ages, the skyscrapers of the first proper modern cities, Chicago and New York in the 19th century, the first thing that we want to do when we get a bit of money and a bit of knowledge is to get up into the sky, into the heavens, you know, away from the earth. That it is literally aspiration in its most concrete form. And I think that there are problems with London. I think London's future at the moment is in the balance. I mean, London benefited probably more than anywhere else from the two trends, most dominant recent trends in the global economy. One is financialisation, the growth of the finance economy, and the other is globalisation. You know, London became the centre of globalisation in many ways, and took advantage of the opening up of markets right across the world. That's why there's so many rich people here, why people here have got richer and richer compared with the average. The disparities of income have increased massively. There's no question about that. It also led to a big increase in demand for brain power. So, you know, the fact that half the people who in the working population in London have got degrees is a symptom of that demand for clever people to manage and in many cases often manipulate, as we know, the financial kind of goings on in the city. And it's also true, I think, as Martin said, that it's indisputable that London subsidises the rest of the UK. You know, the tax that's gathered here goes out of the city and helps to keep the rest of the economy going. So, you know, London's not a perfect place, but it is, I think, the best city in the world. And it's certainly true that it's better than the alternative. And I think that's the point Sunder was making, is what would the alternative be? Would we be trying to level everything down, level the cities, return to the countryside? What is the alternative to what we have now? And I think that, on balance, I would say that the aspirational aspects of London are far more important than the inequalities that exist there.
Great, thank you very much, Rob. Okay, just want to ask a few questions of each of the panel, really, and then we'll come out to you for your questions. So if you give me kind of points, so if you give me thinking as we go as to what you want to say, that'd be great. But Martin, if I could come to you first, because I wonder, are you just being a bit blasé, really? You know, because take some of the stuff that Anna was talking about, and you know, are you just dismissing it a bit too easily? Because it is the case that if you look at, for example, life expectancy, and you look at Kensington, and then you look at Newham, for example, then you know there's quite a substantial difference in how long you're expected to live. So, in that sense, kind of inequality, you could argue, has got a real, you know, it's got a real, it real and quite problematic ways.
Yeah, I wasn't necessarily dismissing inequality as such. The question I was raising was there's an issue about how you take it up, because I would be against inequality, but the way in which arguments against inequality was argued against in the past was that you had an assumption that growth would happen within a society, and people would demand a larger share of the cake. I mean, sometimes it was caricatured as saying left-wingers were arguing for a larger share of a fixed cake, but it wasn't an assumption that if you organise a society in maybe what I talk about 1940s and 50s, it was organised around the industry, and people would demand a larger share of that. That's wholly different, I think, from the situation you've got now, whereby you have essentially it's what I call the politics of pity, essentially, where people, middle class people with a bit of money are looking at poor people essentially and saying that we should pity them, they can't get out there, because to go back to your point about people living not as long, I mean, there's always a big way to be that. I mean, people in the past were a lot shorter if you were poor and if you were rich. But the point is, working class people then had a sense that they could do something about it.
Yeah, but if it's there's something not being done about it, and as I say today, there is that difference in age difference. Or for example, a lot of poorer areas did descend into riots last summer. Then is there not a case for doing something about that?
Well, I mean, we've been trying to do something about it for years now. I think the approach to regeneration was to say we need to essentially equalise the regions entirely. And also in relation to that, when the authors of these experiences are saying that people are living shorter, they're not arguing short because of absolute poverty. What they're saying is that the actual experience of being poor causes social problems, or a poor relationship to rich people. So if everybody was getting richer, you would, and the wealth disparity would remain the same, you would still have people not living as well.
Okay, that's fine. So maybe then, Anna, you should come back on that a bit, because your kind of argument of Canary Wharf and the Beaver Towers. I mean, is it just is it
quite how I look at it?
Okay.
I mean, I'm just bothered by this polarity, which is seeming to a lot of this debate seems to be very polarised. The evil towers of Canary Wharf and
that was the Guardian's
right.
description.
I mean, I was quite pleased, I suppose, to hear Rob use the words that there is no alternative towards the end of his talk, because it's, I think that is one of the themes that we're hearing today, this big polarity in this debate between, this aspirational growth model that we have been following and the city of inequalities that we are discussing. And this is raised as the choice we've got. And actually, a lot of people, and Rob echoed a view, which I think is prevailing among some members of the panel, that there is no alternative but to continue with this model. And just to use some of this language, I think that shows a real poverty of aspiration. I mean, we've seen the financial crisis, we've seen how moribund this model is. Sunder was talking about balanced economies, and the difficulty of moving towards a more balanced economy. But it's a challenge we've got to grasp and be excited about, rather than just trotting out this Thatcherite mantra of there is no alternative. But just one point of Martin's I wanted to pick up. I think you said that regeneration, the point of regeneration has been to equalise the regions. I mean,
That's new Labour.
okay, well that is, I'm afraid, just not my reading of it at all. I mean, my reading of regeneration over the last generation has been the trickle-down model. It's to create these engines of wealth in every region and every city, with the justification that it will trickle down, which it fails to do, and instead we've created these ever more divided cities. So I think your reading of regeneration, I'm afraid I can't agree with it at all.
Okay, and one more thing then. Just because you said that inequality creates a climate of fear and distrust. Now, I mean, as Rob says, there is the gaps probably have increased over recent years, but nevertheless, kind of poverty and richness is something that's existed. It's an age-old difference, and yet at different times in history, there's not really been that same sort of climate of fear and distrust.
I mean, I think, if we went back to Thomas Cromwell's London, I think we would probably find a very fearful and violent city. And, similarly in Victorian times, and I think we have seen a period in more recent history where we have had a much more civilised city, and I think that's something that we very much want to hold on to, rather than to lose our democratic achievements of strangers being able to live together and alongside each other in the city. I mean, things have changed. I can only talk about my own lifetime. I can't really talk about the past. I wasn't there. But within my lifetime, things have changed radically. In London, where I grew up, parts of London which used to be very mixed places have now become either, very affluent enclaves where house prices are unaffordable unless you are on really very significantly higher incomes, and similarly with the schools and the sort of catchment and the demographic you get, and then other parts of London which, really, I mean, I do have to say, are on a different planet. And I think that's very, very problematic, and I think that does breed fear.
What I'm asking is that behind the climate of fear and distrust?
Well, yes, absolutely. When you have we have a lot of research now showing when you have sharply visible differences between people, that's what that people are very scared of that. Fear of crime doesn't have anything to do with actual crime figures, but it correlates directly with trust. And when you have these people are very scared of difference. And when you have these clearly sharp, visible differences, that creates, that undermines trust between people, and that creates fear. So we've got this big paradox in the UK. Fear of crime has been going down steadily since 1995, but fear of crime is soaring. Actual crime has been going down, and fear of crime is soaring. And it comes down, in my mind, actually, very large, a big part of this, not just the only factor, the media and various other factors are huge, but a big part of this is the very visible differences, both in the landscape, the sort of architecture that we're increasingly living in, sort of high security architecture that actively excludes, but also in the very visible differences between people.
Okay, that's, we should try and work this through, I think, because I think this is a kind of really important issue and one that we can have a chat about. But Sunder, if I can just come to you, because you were talking about the necessity for more balanced growth, and you talked about redistribution first off, and then you started to talk about something which I wasn't quite sure what you meant, but you said psychological polarization emerging. So can you just explain, first of all, what you see as the growth? So is it balanced in the sense that, it's not an absolutely bigger cake, it's just cut in different sizes, different sort of portions, distributed more evenly? And what do you mean by this idea of psychological polarization?
And I mean, I'm quite sympathetic to the argument Anna's making, but I want to just disagree with something in a way that I think makes the critique of trickle down harder, because I think the critique of trickle down would be easier if it was the case that New Labour was just interested in carrying on with trickle down. I think it's harder now because I think they've had a different strategy to that, which has run its course, and that makes it even harder in a way to see it. So in a sense, I don't see New Labour as having turbocharged inequality. I think on the whole, they mitigated it, except they left it in the top 1%. And so by leaving it in the top 1%, and they mitigated it, if you look at, say, what's called 90-10 inequality, how are people from 10% in the top doing 10% at the bottom? Inequalities reduce except the right away inequality right at the top. And that's their strategy. And it's a Faustian strategy, because they, in a sense, they've taken the economic model, but they're doing something different with the proceeds of growth. Why there's growth? They spend a lot on health spending. They should spend more on education. They spend quite a lot on education, but they really prioritise health spending. They prioritise urban regeneration of the major, very close centres of the other big cities, and they're very, very different. But they don't have a different political economy. And that very moderate social democracies, what they're doing is they're running up and down escalators. They're putting quite a significant amount of resource and political energy into holding inequality where it was, without being able to reverse it. And that very modest social democratic project's blown up, because the Faustian patch blows up and the bubble bursts. But we forget that Faust got quite a long run. So, because they didn't have a different political economy, you want a different political economy, but who's got one? And then, of course there's a need for an alternative, but it's extremely hard to see it and to build confidence in it. And what happened there, Scotland's actually kept pace as a region with the southeast and with London, and the other regions there was some growth, but they didn't keep pace. Now, I'm less worried about the inequalities within London than about these other inequalities, because I think we risk going from mobility to immobility, generally. But I think it would be easier for there to be mobility within London. Well, it's actually, I mean, just, you know, the stratification of London, so that if you're you know, a talented, ambitious person in Northern City or Scotland, you come to London, you'll be coming to sort of, you know, zone 5, 6 and beyond, not to very central London. The stratification's within it. And it's just because we've hit this austerity era. It was, you know, the previous debate was quite a soft debate. New Labour and Cameron were talking about where you spend the money. You give it to people in tax cuts, or you get, when there isn't any growth and you're cutting public services.
But is it not the case that people would come to a city like London because they see opportunities? So to some extent, the inequalities that are within London
they won't be able to do it.
Are because it's attracting people who are at the lower end of the spectrum who see opportunities to.
People will struggle. People will find it much harder to do it in 2015 than they would have found it in 1985, or they would have found it in 1965, just because of the intergenerational pattern of wealth and property and assets. So, you know, what property your parents own, your grandparents own is increasingly affecting geographically where you'll be able to live.
But is it the case then that you know, the newspaper articles that say that just because we produce a Canary Wharf, that necessarily means that there's, you know, that other people are going to suffer? That's the way that a lot of these arguments are presented these days.
I think that might be either or. That might be too sharp. You know, but inequality is inequality that's always. I mean, the reason I worry less about the inequality within London is because the geographical mobility is easier if we did something about it. You still need interventions to do something about it, but the best reason to be hopeful about London and equality in London is that school results in the last 10 or 15 years, absolutely. The school results in the last 10 years are amazing. And the school results of poorer children with minority backgrounds and Pakistani and Bangladeshi girls in particular are amazing. Now, whether that follows through the workplace or not, but there's more chance of, you know, giving people the opportunities to say, you know, feel very autonomous, go for whatever you want, join the top law firm, etc. It's people from quite poor backgrounds in Tower Hamlets, I suspect, than there is for people from quite poor backgrounds on the outer edges of Manchester, Newcastle, Hartlepool, the places that are losing population, because they won't find it as easy to get on the train and chase their dream as they would because of the opportunities that they'll have. Now, London, I think, is a place to do something.
Let's leave it there, and we can pick it up again in the discussion. But just to come to Rob before I come out to the audience. Rob, you talked about the Shard, and well, you seem to put it in a line of continuity from the churches of the Middle Ages built up, and then eventually you get to the kind of financial centres of contemporary society, and they build up. But is the argument not that would come back that, well, churches had some sort of public good, they were a kind of public function, whereas the grand towers of the financial centres of this world are privatised and don't so much act as a public good as against the public good. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think it goes back to what I was saying, because I know, and I know I'm not alone in this, that when the Shard was being built, I was fascinated by it. I felt excited by it, the way that it changed so rapidly, the way that it was transforming the skyline of London. And, and yet I know that other people would say, yes, it's terrible the way it's transforming the skyline of London. In some ways, it's an aesthetic judgment. You either like. I mean, there are some buildings, modern buildings, which I hate. I hate this building, for example. I hate this kind of this 50s, 60s brutal kind of thing where that should all be torn down. I don't know, but that's my personal judgment on all this. And I think there is I'm sympathetic to some of Anna's points. I mean, although it's not quite the way that she presents it. The middle classes are the most ruthless colonisers of all. Right? It's the middle classes that have driven the white working class out of parts of inner London. It's not the builders of the Shard and those kind of people. Right? They don't even live here. They live in Abu Dhabi or wherever it is. I think that there's a certain kind of aspect of this debate which is about self-disgust and guilt of the middle classes about what they have done in London and what they're doing, and the kind of the rise of the cappuccino culture and all this kind of stuff. So you find it's actually the very people who've taken advantage of the housing, cheap housing in Hackney or in South London or wherever, who are writing the articles about what a terrible thing this is. And I find that a bit, fair enough. We can all feel bad about that if we want to. But it's a complicated thing. I mean, why have the middle classes moved back into inner London? They spent most of the previous period moving out into the suburbs and everything. But lots of rundown parts of inner London are now like Esher would have been, 30 years ago, full of people who were sending their kids to trying to get the local schools up to a level and all this kind of stuff. That is a relatively recent phenomenon, and something which I don't think has been properly examined as to what exactly is going on there. But it's got nothing to do with Renzo Piano or any of those people. It's got nothing to do with them really, except as far as some of those people will work in the finance sector, but not as rich bankers. It's not rich bankers buying houses in Hackney for 300 grand and doing them up. There's something else that's gone on there. Which you say, well, is that a good or bad? I mean, I quite like the fact that areas which 20 years ago you would have been afraid of walking down the streets of are now quite nice, frankly. And there's lots more bits of inner London which are attractive rather than horrible. I mean, it's also the case, by the way, that there's timescale thing here, right? So we're talking. I think that what's happened in London is not that living standards have gone down. Living standards have gone up, but the disparity between the rich and the poor has got bigger at the same time. So there's two slightly contradictory things going on. People are much better off in London now than they've ever been. The standard of living is much higher than it was. And I remember when I was a kid and brought up in Greenwich, you would stand at the top of the hill in Greenwich and look over a wasteland, right, beyond the Maritime Museum. The docks were completely over, finished. You go there now, and there's a whole new city has emerged there in the last 30, 40 years, and people are living there. They weren't living there before.
Okay, that's. I think this question of whether it's whether the overall increase is sufficient, or whether it's the differences, the bigger differences that's the problem is kind of something worth exploring. But so questions and points. I'm going to take about 3-4 at a time, and then come back for some brief responses to the panel. You don't need to answer everything that comes up. Just pick up on what you want. So over here first.
Okay.
Wait a second.
Okay, it was just to say, I thought there was a sort of obsession with the inequalities in London, and I just wanted, does the difference in inequality matter if the condition of everybody is improving? And so I think Anna was sort of wringing her hands about the inequality, or some people being not doing as well. But what also, you aren't really offering an alternative apart from suggesting the inequality should be leveled down. And are you then sort of promoting a sort of anti-growth strategy as the only alternative, which doesn't seem very attractive to most, to me. And then just one more question. I mean, the flight to the suburbs. We could see that in a positive way because it just might be making London bigger in a sense. The urbanisation is getting bigger, so I don't think we should only see it in a depressing light.
Okay, how many people want to speak? So the gentleman in the white there.
Hi, I'm a huge fan of Anna Minton's ground control. I felt it was revelatory to me about the processes that we've seen transform British cities, not necessarily for the good. I'm too concerned about this focus on inequality. I think we'll always have inequalities. They're drivers and indicators of problems. But the bigger problem, which lies beneath that, is the disenfranchisement and if you like, the inability of us to build structures within our cities that allow for social engagement, for the forum for social activity. And part of the privatisation of urban development has actually been the complete exclusion of those social processes. And frankly, perhaps what we need is many more riots in our cities to break that cycle if no one else comes out with a political strategy for urban and future development which actually engages with the population.
Can you just say what you mean by social processes of engagement? What is that?
We've almost architecturally and urban designed out social processes of democracy and a functioning civic society. And by continually privatising the urban developments that are documented in our Minton's ground control. And, systematic exclusion. The Victorians, for all their faults, built many forums for social engagement and social support frameworks. I don't have clear examples. I'm not an urban planner. I teach designers at very high
I just thought it
level.
might help us understand.
But I think we need far more radical alternatives.
Okay, there's a gentleman in front of you with the white jacket. Thank you.
No, I think Anna's question, she asked the question, does trickle down work? And I think that does get to the nub. I'd say yes, it does, but it doesn't necessarily help the existing population in an area. So, for instance, in Docklands, going back to that period, I think Rob and the end there described it quite well, the desolation that existed when the docks closed in the 60s and 70s. What was going to happen. One of the tragedies is that the local authorities of those areas, the councils that represented people, actually turned against, were fighting against redevelopment. And that's where the Thatcher government stepped in and overrode local democracy and, yes, imposed something in a quite authoritarian way, the Docklands Development Corporation, which that's quite a tragic thing that happened, that the people that those authorities and the people that represented them, if you like, the left, had turned against development and future development. But nevertheless, if you look at Canary Wharf now, I think it's incontestable that there's 100,000 people working there. Of course, they're perhaps not people from the Isle of Dogs, they're people that have come from all over the world to work there. But that trickle there has worked, it has spread to parts of Lewisham, certainly over the river in the south of Birmingham City, where I live. They have been transformed, and that to me is being part of a dynamic city, and that's something to be celebrated.
Okay, and the lady next to you, and then I'll come back to the panel, and then we'll come out again for the next round.
Following from that, I think that development, we should specify more this problem about this gap between the rich and the poor when development kicks in and enrich the urban landscape, because in my experience and from what I can see, it's true that this gap becomes wider, but also is that very true that actually the poverty is, in a sense, the number of poor and their level of poverty is reduced. So even if there is the gap, because, you know, if I'm on, I don't know, on number 10, the rich is on number 15, but my number 10 with development will be maintained or enriched. So I think that even if we are concentrated on the gap between rich and poor, we should consider actually the quality of life that development could bring, and it brings actually, to the underprivileged.
Okay. Is there any, do you want to come back on any of these?
Yeah,
Just come along the panel.
A few points.
Yeah.
Brought up. So does the difference in inequality matter if the condition of everyone is improving? Well, you know, it's clear, I think, from everything I've said, that I don't think, in fact, I know that the condition of everyone is not improving. And when I wrote the new chapter of my book focusing on the legacy of the Olympic developments, I spent quite a lot of time in Newham, looking at housing conditions in Newham, going to terraces where 2 up, 2 down would find 30 to 40 men living there like sardines, with illegal garden sheds in back gardens, with people living in those as well. And actually I was told by somebody who works for Shelter, they even had a client living in a commercial fridge and paying rent for it. So, you know, I mean, I think one of the real big difficulties with the sort of debates that opinion formers have together is really, you know, we have no idea how some people in this city, in this country, are living. And I mean, well, I agree with Sunder that I think if you are living in a deprived part of Hartlepool or, you know, a deprived part of Salford, it actually is going to be more difficult for you than if you are living in one of the streets I've just described in Tower Hamlets. I think it is, because proximity, and as you say, there are public services and there are, you know, there has been some great work in schools in London. So I do agree with that point. But I mean, you know, there were kids that I talked to, and they're probably the same kids who were involved in the riots, you know, who had never been out of Newham. They'd never been into town. They'd never been to the West End. They'd never been to the sea. So, I mean, I think you have to bear these things in mind when you say the condition of everyone is improving. No, it's not, but they're hidden. They're invisible, particularly to us. Now, what am I promoting as an alternative? Am I promoting an anti-growth strategy? My God, how horrific. I am trying to promote a much more regulated form of capitalism. I'm not arguing for a revolution here. I'm arguing for a fundamental reform and a much more regulated form of capitalism, starting, of course, at the top with the financial system and the sort of regulations that we've seen stripped away since Big Bang being actually introduced and pinning our financial system into some sort of reality. It's floated off into some kind of abstraction where debt has doubled just in this period, you know, than in our whole history. So yes, I'm certainly promoting an enormous break on the excessive levels of growth, which in fact means debt, that we've seen up until this point. A couple of other points. Again, this point came up about the desolation that existed in Docklands beforehand. And again, it's this polarity. We had this devastating post-industrial landscape, so of course it's better that we've created this. Well, that wasn't the choice. yes, we had a devastated post-industrial landscape, and we could have created a much more balanced economy, which would have filled that devastated industrial landscape with housing and jobs, but not in privatised estates, etc. So I've probably said enough.
Yeah, that's pretty the next comment in the next round. So, Martin, just a few or one or two responses.
Right, okay. First of all, I'm just interested in this question about designing out democracy. It is an interesting one. I think in terms of there's some truth that the elements of the design do have an effect. Politically, there was the famous redesign of Paris, London, and probably the third, where they widened the streetways so that it couldn't be barricaded. So there are examples like that. I think the question you have to ask about the design is, would there be a better democracy if the city was designed differently? I'm not convinced it would be. To my mind, politics comes first, but this is its obsession. If you build a town square, say, then if the people will somehow engage in politics more, if you remove cars on the road, then people will kind of talk to each other. And I think actually people probably create their own public uses of space, no matter what it is. You know, I mean, you could decline the shopping centres. People flock to the shopping centres. So they are popular. People could always choose not to go. The other point I want to make, this issue about larger cities and poverty. There's an interesting statistic that the closer to London you go, if you're a low-skilled worker, the more likely you are to get a job. So the city expansion would be good in that sense. That actually disappears when you actually get into London itself. It's interesting, and it may be to do with the competition. The competition for job. London is so popular. You've got competition outside London and from abroad that it's hard to do your skill.
Okay. So, anything you want to pick?
Yeah.
No more than one or 2 points.
I'm going to make the case for kind of nuance and complexity and sitting on the fence a bit. Everyone agrees that both the absolute levels and the relative levels matter. Because if we give you a case where you can crash the economy and get more equality that way, you won't take it. I give you a case like India 20 years ago, everyone would have taken a bit more inequality to do something about absolute levels of poverty, and then would worry about how to modify it. So we actually care about inequality. It does matter psychologically where you are in the community you live in, and we care about growth. And so it is a question of balance. So
it matters psychologically.
Well, it does. I mean, there are studies of chimpanzees and there are studies of civil servants.
Well, we're not
chimpanzees. Well, we are actually in this sense. So they show the same thing, that actually you care about your relative position within the group, and that's because the group is a community. So we actually care about inequalities when they get stratified, when they break the community, because we have different experiences, different rules, etc. We're actually quite sanguine about lottery winner inequality, and actually pop star inequality and footballer inequality. We don't like footballer inequality because it's aesthetically not very pleasing and because it looks a bit overvalued, but we know it's meritocratic. Whereas sort of bankers who all go to a private school elite, and then there's locked-in opportunities if you're, depending on how your parents did,
that's natural rather than a social condition of just now.
Because people essentially care about the process of fair rules and fair competition, and then accept inequalities for the James Dysons and the Richard Bransons as quite a good thing if they haven't got locked-in kind of inequalities for people who obviously don't merit it. I.e., the undeserving rich are actually the problem. And so, you know, footballers don't deserve so much money, but they're obviously the best footballers. Bankers, whether the best bankers or not, don't appear to be doing the thing they said they were doing, which is making the economy work for everybody. But what we really care about is if it breaks intergenerational opportunities, if it actually smashes the society apart. So there's a them and us point. One more point, which is to say, the point that was made about, you know, much less violent society, much lower crime, more quality of urban life, at the same time as there's rising inequality, and then there's less trust. But as you can notice that, where is there less trust? Trust is actually holding up in the diverse areas quite well, because you've got visible difference, but you have mixing. It's going really badly in the homogenous white areas because there's a lot of mixing down the road and it looks very scary, but you don't have a connection with it. And it's really bad in very mixed areas where there isn't a point of connection, like northern cities or Tower Hamlets.
But is that the point?
So the them and us thing really matters. Now, where is there most stratification at the moment? It's actually around people in social housing and people aren't. Actually, we're a more mixed across ethnic and faith lines community, except maybe in bits of Tower Hamlets and bits of Bradford. But we're actually a less mixed social class society, and so we don't have them and us around social housing anymore.
Okay, let's hold it there. I remain to be convinced, I have to say. But Rob, if you want to pick up on anything, or maybe actually even come back on this point about Anna's about we need a more regulated form of capitalism. But anything you want.
I think that the migrant labourers and jammed into their bathrooms in Newark is a real thing. Obviously, it does exist. But they are, in a way, wiser than the columnists of The Guardian, because the reason they're doing that is, first of all, because however bad it is better than the circumstances that they came from. And secondly, because they can see a route out of their conditions of life through doing this. They are aspirational, they are pursuing their self-interest to better themselves and create opportunities for their families which wouldn't otherwise exist. Now, whether or not they can achieve that is a different matter. And I think that it's just a fact of history that social mobility in societies is greater when you have economic growth, and it falls when you don't, generally speaking. And so, you know, the real clue to the resolution of the discussion we're having is how do we get a high growth economy. We know that some of the recent growth was built on credit and was false and all this kind of stuff, that's true. But we can't draw the conclusion from that the problem is growth itself, because without growth there will be no opportunity, there will be no, all there will be, in the best case scenario, is a levelling out and a sort of sharing out the misery, basically, which is really what the whole government's current austerity thing is all about. It's about making people feel bitter and envious about people who've got more than them, rather than focusing on doing what the migrant labourers are doing, which is just getting on with it and trying to regenerate some kind of economic activity which will improve the lives of many, not everybody, right? There's never going to be, in any foreseeable scenario, a society which everybody gets lifted up to the same level, right? That's really utopian. The current moment is about how do we get growth going again, how do we get some dynamism into the economy, and how do we help people who do aspire to making their lives better.
Okay, how many people want to speak? Can you just get a sense of how many? Right, okay, I'm going to start over here and work my way back. So, in the front row there.
I come from a city medium-sized of 10 million people in China. And I spent 2 years studying in the rural part of China. Just what you talked about, people you have elected, not everyone is national. Where I studied, where I spent the 2 years in the rural part of China, the condition was so harsh. People at the age from 10 to 18 study more than 10, 12 hours a day. And in the harsh winter, they cycle for miles to come to school, and all their hands, everyone, develop these frostbite conditions that will come back every year. They had the minimum, and they made the best of the condition that we had. And what I want to bring out is this, here in this country, I hear a lot of talk about, the government should do this, the leadership should do that. We are not giving enough support, enough help about other people. But I think that's not to the core of the problem, though. The core of the solution, I think, comes from self-motivation. It's like a patient. If I'm ill, I could get drugs, I could get good nursing care, but don't forget, I could self-heal as well. I think in this country, I'm not seeing enough of this self-healing, which might be most empowering.
Okay, thank you very much. And you just pass the microphone to the camera.
Yeah, actually, my question goes to Anna. You spoke much about Labour's social approach. See, Labour's approach to socialist religion. Can you highlight some failures and successes of New Labour's approach?
Okay, can you hand the microphone across to the guy in the front? No, forward. Yes.
I think I just want to pick up, maybe Anna misquoted wrong, because I didn't say there is no alternative. I think said, what is the alternative? Which is what I've got this little notepad here. Well, it seems like the alternative, what has to be the alternative, is that London needs to grow, it cannot be restricted. And therefore, how London has grown and absorbed much of Essex, a lot of Essex. Redbridge used to be Essex, but it's actually London now. And how does, I wouldn't want to call it sprawl, but the spread of London is so important. So I want to ask the panel, do we need to consider building beyond Zone 6 and let London spread and grow to be the dynamic city that it is of the kind of mix of living, both in terms of spread of suburbia, perhaps, vis-a-vis the kind of urban centre. And also, I used to work in Newham, and Newham used to be a real wasteland in Stratford and West Ham, for example. What you have is a great change. I think Westfield's shopping centre is actually a very important space for employment and for young people, particularly in Europe, to get jobs when there was no jobs in the area.
Okay, and if you pass it back to there, a lot of people are saying that we need to grow both the economy and the city. That's something that the government are saying as well. So if everybody's agreed that we need to grow, then kind of one of the questions to maybe mull over is, what is the problem with growth? Why are we not growing? But yes.
I want to say that I'm all for the Shard and Docklands if it opens the gates to more developments. I mean, as a young person in London, I am a representative of a social group that is disproportionately hit by the shortage of housing and the high rents that are a direct result of that. And it seems to me there's an instinctual dislike in England in particular and in Europe in general to building upwards. And I would say that if the Docklands help convince people that skyscrapers are not inherently horrible, then sure, build more Docklands.
Okay, and there's just in the next row, yeah, the glasses.
Thanks. I'd like to hear about the future of London. To discuss the past period, I think it's obvious that the sort of past 25 years or so have been featured sort of the leading role of finance capital, and that's really shaped the city. So what comes next? I'm not asking you to predict the future, but as far as I can see, the role of finance capital is not really being challenged in the economy, but we are going to have the period of the new normal or a permanent crisis or something like that. So how will that shape the city? Associated to that is the fact of unemployment, which will continue to be a serious problem. Perhaps not rise because it might be mopped up by programs such as workfare, with the state becoming the employer of last resort or something like that. But ultimately, how does the city deal with people that effectively capital has no use for, and how does that transform social spaces? For my part, I can only see an extension of the sort of tendencies that Anna Minton has already has described in her book, but maybe you have a more hopeful or optimistic vision.
Okay, thank you. And then there's in the row behind. Can I just see, is there anyone else after this person that wants to speak? Any more questions or points? Okay. Yes, go ahead.
So trickle down, the social product goes up, but I think there's an overclaim that the increase in the social product can be contained and become a benefit for a place. So that's clearly, you know, a piece of branding hype fundamentally from Heseltine onwards. The reality is that, I mean, I believe absolutely that the economic drivers over the past 20 years or so have indeed increased wealth in London, and you know there have been jobs created in Southall, you know, right the way across the kind of Brixton, elsewhere people come and work in Canary Wharf. But it's absolutely true to say that that there still remains sharp divides. So inequality gets reproduced both socially and spatially in the course of the process. So I think there's a kind of problem if your political strategy, and you know it has been a political strategy for a substantial number of people, is to say that you can have local interventions to remake places through regeneration programs, and that's what gets exposed in this process. Well, my observation, and you know, Anna's book is brilliant. You should read it. It really is, and it's kind of, you know, it kind of calls the lie of the kind of hype of some of the programs. But I do think that you know that actually, you know, when you attack the developer, you know, from Argent for King's Cross, you find that they agree. When you're kind of challenged to the Legacy Development Corporation, they too are hyper aware of the need to manage the edges of the development, to knit into the built fabric, to create trust, and to try to milk benefits. And so I think that the idea that you can do the whole thing more equitably, is a kind of there's kind of boroughs, things like that, things that they can those sorts of benefits. So I think there's a kind of deeper problem to do with the overclaim that you can manage capitalism in that kind of spatially integrated way. But I do think that notwithstanding the fact that maybe nobody here is saying that they're not against growth, people do draw the conclusion that actually growth itself is a bad thing, and that you should start off with a more kind of equitable social form or something. And so I do think that there is a very real problem with the walking away of a substantial number of people from the idea of being aspirational and supporting economic growth.
Okay, and if you can go to the very back row.
Thanks a lot. Well, I think it's a bit of a shame really that there hasn't been more debate about how there could be a change in the centre of economic power in London. I mean, especially given the fact that David Cameron and George Bourne, they really believe that the City of London is the most important part of the economy of the nation. But it's found on such as continues to be run. It's such a contradiction between the ideology of free market capitalism being the engine for democracy and the practice which is seen in the city. I mean, the banking crisis shows us completely. It's not at all about free trade. It's just about protecting those established centres of wealth. And I think the fact that international migrant labour coming to this country and living packed in houses 30, 40 apiece as following their self-interest. I mean, we've got to remember that a lot of these people are coming because the countries they're coming from have really been forced into pretty desperate conditions by development packages run by the IMF and organisations which really favour places like the City of London because they do maintain these kind of new kind of colonial divisions of wealth and equality. So it's a real shame that, I mean, it's not more possible to think about how to make the city fairer by reducing this. Well, I guess it is a need to keep this going, but I guess that's the way the city's been built and the way it's going to carry on, which is terrible in my opinion.
Okay, ending to the comments from the floor. And is there any final comments before I just come back? Yes.
Quick one. I mean, I just think there's a lot of talk about the government's growth agenda and even regarding that IMF's development policy. Actually, they don't actually believe in development. There's been a whole series of discussions, on overseas stuff, which is anti-development now, against big projects, against, it's all about sustainable development, not development. So I think that's a sort of like a false idea, people are talking about growth, but even the government doesn't really believe in growth. They talk about regulating the market, and even the Conservatives are talking about that. So that's a false notion.
Okay, no last points? Okay, so in reverse order, I'll take the panel, and there's about a minute for any final comments that you want to make. Rob?
Well, I wouldn't like everyone to think that I think this is the best of all possible worlds or anything like that. I think that my main concern, and I think is where I do completely disagree with Anna, is that the solution to our problems is more regulation. Because what does that mean? It means that government bodies, state bodies, are going to try to control or channel the economy. Now, that's never worked. That's never been the basis for a growth economy. More government control, more state control. Except in very specific instances where governments have channeled investment into certain parts of the economy, which I'm actually in favour of. But I don't think that's really what Anna's talking about. And the proponents of more regulation are basically, they don't like capitalism, but they don't see an alternative to it. And in the absence of, and I think that's summed up by the guy at the back, fine, so what? Where does that get us? And the reaction to that lack of an alternative is to try to say, well, let's try to mitigate the worst aspects of capitalism. But in doing that, what you're really doing is clamping down on the most dynamic part of capitalism, which is expressed through self-interest and through aspiration. So you end up doing more harm than good. And I think that's the problem. I think that we should be building more houses. We should abolish housing benefit, which is the indirect subsidy to the middle class property owners, which has helped to inflate property rental price and everything else in London. There are things that can be done, but it should not be about cutting back on aspiration and self-interest.
Okay, Sunder.
Thanks. I don't think people are moving away from growth as an idea. In fact, I think they're moving away from it rather less than they were a few years ago. People used to talk a lot about happiness and we haven't got happiness with growth, or about environmentalism, and actually not having growth. People now seem rather keen on it. So the problems of not having growth seem to be more kind of prominent, but how the growth is distributed is very important. Now, if somebody said it cannot be restricted, let it grow, actually, of course, it can be restricted, and therefore, if it doesn't want to be restricted, it's got to get a coalition of support that says this is good for enough people to let it happen. And if it's perceived that it should grow in the interests of the super rich, oligarchs, often foreign, and the poorest migrant labourers who will be prepared to take the worst deal to make it all kind of happen, that is not a coalition that people will let you kind of have, actually. So unless it spreads out to say houses for young people, youth jobs, etc., and says this is the way to have growth that we spread, it actually won't be able to grow. And so this is the case for sort of depolarising it. Now, final thought is, I don't think I managed to convince you about this sort of sociological, psychological polarisation. I think what I was trying to say is that I think there are two big political tribes, the old traditional political tribes, which are Labour and Tory, and they still got a third of the population each. And in a moment of austerity and no growth, actually they become kind of harder, they become more separated between north and south, between private sector and public sector. And one says, the future will work fine, and the other says, well, it all looks like it's going to be quite scary. And most people are a lot of other people are left out somewhere in between too. The case for London, actually, it's not that it's off the edge somewhere else, it's actually one of the very few places where both of these tribes exist. There is private and public, there is local choice. So it's actually a place perhaps to actually settle and debate the argument and come to some point about how to balance it differently.
Okay, thank you. Anne?
Yeah, well, I just want to clarify a little bit about growth, first of all. What I'm really opposed to is the current growth model, which is based on debt. And we have a very, very big problem with debt. And I don't think we've really addressed what we mean when we talk about growth and defined it properly, but that's the subject of another session entirely. So I will take the lady's point here in the front, who said that the solution to some of the terrible poverty that she witnessed in parts of rural China, and we really should be looking much more to self-motivation. Well, I think I was very pleased to hear the gentleman's comments at the back, which really put this in some sort of context and put this in a global economic context. And I mean, I think we've heard a few sideswipes against the sort of the cappuccino classes and the Guardian columnists, as if somehow it's them who are responsible for the displacement of large numbers of people and are responsible for changing the social fabric of the city. Well, I mean, I think that is really giving far too much credit to Guardian readers and, you know, middle class sort of hand wringers. You know, of course, it's global social and economic forces which are responsible here, and we haven't really sort of addressed that full on. Just to come back to your point about motivation,
Final point.
yeah, it's linked. Okay, I probably don't have enough time to say. I wanted to pull up something that Sunder had mentioned about social housing being a place now of exclusion. When I was growing up, social housing was a mixed tenure with a wide range of people living in it. Primary schools were the same. That's the kind of primary school I went to. That's why we had greater opportunity and mobility in this country, and no amount of social motivation can overcome that sort of economic change. And it's literally, it's things like the sell-off of council houses and the change of the school system, which have actually mitigated massively against that. And I'm afraid no amount of self-motivation is going to be able to counter that. You are giving much...
Thank you, Martin. 60 seconds, very much.
Okay, I just want to briefly address this question about whether we say the city can grow in perpetuity. I know there's good arguments for and against the City of London. I think, however, we slightly, it's a bit limited because there is still potential for growth elsewhere in the economy. Everybody are obsesses about the city, but we're still one of the top 8 industrial nations in the world. It employs a lot of new people, but the point about the growth of cities is that cities can be clusters for very specialised industries, or education, or whatever it may be. And raise this point about the local area partnerships, because there is potential for democracy at city level, where cities can choose how they grow, and that's why I'm concerned about the actual authoritarian aspects of the inequality debate.
Okay, thank you very much to all the panel. I mean, from my point of view, actually, just before we finish, I mean, it's quite simple, actually. I mean, if you look historically at the drive to gain greater equality, it's always been about increasing material wealth and increasing social freedoms and urban freedoms. And a lot of the debate just now about inequality is actually going in completely opposite direction. It's not about growth, although everybody says they want to grow. Actually, when you really look at it, it's about constraints on growth. And actually, the consequences of a lot of this stuff is constraints on social freedom. That's why I think it's important to hub this debate out. I hope everybody enjoyed it. Go to the bookshop, buy Anna's book and get it signed, and can we thank our panel?